Hello, BookTube. As you can see, I have yet another guest. This is Hannah from Hannah's Books. We
Hello.
have a madcap idea. We have an idea that may not succeed at all. Hannah and I are both working book critics. We both review books as in her case, a burgeoning side hustle. In my case, is the only tenant that holds up the roof. And we thought it might be interesting for two book critics to go through the foremost English language book review journal in the world. For good or ill, that is the New York Times Book Review, specifically the big pullout section they do on the weekend. They and the Wall Street Journal are among the few remaining newspapers that do that. Once upon a time, almost all of them did. It was assumed that you would want a pullout book review section that you could tuck under your arm and take to the bookstore. It's not assumed anymore, but we had this madcap idea. And the reason why, there are many reasons why it's madcap. First of all, as luck would have it, the book review that we chose this time around is the summer reading issue. It's enormous, absolutely enormous. Second, as those of you who watch both our channels will know, Hannah and I are very different personalities. And also very different reviewers and very different readers.
I think that's very true. Thank you so much for having me on. I think you're really right that starting with something as huge as this, not only can you tuck it under your arm to read later, but you can read it all week long. In fact, there are a couple of sections that I was pretty sure we wouldn't be talking about, like the cooking section that I saved to read later. So
all sorts of sections. No matter what kind of book you're interested in, it will be covered in this section, which isn't always true of the weekly book review. Although they try, I get the impression they try their hardest to cover a wide variety. And if memory serves, they still don't have a dedicated Sunday book review section editor.
I don't know for sure that that's true, but I think you're right.
Pamela
I suspect there's someone in charge of it.
Right? And there's nobody.
Right.
Nobody who stepped into her shoes. It should be you.
I would love that.
But it certainly shouldn't be me.
Well, I should confess on two fronts. One is that I haven't written a lot of reviews lately. I've had some other things going on, including some very positive things, like my son graduated from college and working on a writing project other than book reviews. But also, I haven't read many of the books in here, partly because I read very, very little contemporary fiction. I read a lot of backlist, and I read a lot of very, very backlist from early 20th century and earlier than that. I read a lot more nonfiction, but there's far less in the summer issue than usual. So I suspect you have read most of the books.
Well, I did a whole bunch of stats for our inaugural video, but oddly enough, now that I look at my list here, I did not do a stat for how many of the books in this review I've actually read. Isn't that terrible? Although you mentioned more fiction is covered. This issue has 50 reviews in it, and 29 of them are fiction. So,
and then on top of the reviews, there are all of the roundups. Are you including those? Oh, you included those.
I included there are 50 reviews in here.
Wow.
And 29 of them are fiction. So that's over half, but as long as we're doing stats. And Hannah wants to say here, we aren't doing stats. You are. But might you indulge me with a tiny bit of a rant before we go to...
Please.
There are, as I mentioned, 50 reviews in this summer reading issue. And I have my stats here. 37 of those reviews are written by women. There are 120 books total.
I'm sorry, the reviews or the books?
The reviews.
And did you count how many of the books were written by women?
Well, not for the total number of reviews, but there are 125 books covered in this issue, and 74 of them are by women.
Wow.
And there are 25 full-page reviews. So when you're packing in a review like this, you split the page. Hannah mentioned roundups, but the mark of distinction goes to a full page review. There are 25 full page reviews, and 15 of those full page reviews are for books written by women. So the rant that I want to start off with is that we never hear the end of blue-haired check marks on Twitter bemoaning how sexist the publishing and critical space is in America. And I want to say as my opening rant that I completely agree. These numbers certainly paint a markedly sexist picture, and maybe something should be done about that.
Well, it might help if more men bought and read books.
Well, all right, there's that. But the men in this issue are largely confined to violence and sports.
Which are the sections I kind of skipped. So.
The tiny handful of men who are relatively the tiny handful of men who are in here are confined to violence and sports. And if 30 years ago, these percentages had been reversed and the tiny handful of women were confined to cooking and housekeeping, I think, to quote the West Wing, you'd have burnt the building down. So I'm just saying, when the blue check marks on Twitter say that the publishing and critical space is very sexist, they are entirely right. These numbers can't be argued with. So there, that's my troublemaking, my troublemaking road clearing ahead of time.
Well, I'm thrilled to see them represented well, given how many of American readers are women and how few American readers seem to be men. So it doesn't seem unreasonable to me to have a shift. So, do you know the stats on how many books are sold to men these days?
No, I'm sure it's abysmal. But we're not talking about books sold. We're talking about our own profession. How many male reviewers went to the powers that be at the Sunday Book Review and were basically told your kind need not apply? We don't know if that happened. It may be that just male critics read less too. I don't know one way or another. I know for sure that. Well, anyway.
Do you think it's different from other publications? I mean, when you review for various places where you have other reviewers also reviewing,
no.
Is there a similar proportion of male and female reviewers?
The proportions are this or worse, or better, depending on how you look at it. Every publicist that you deal with on a daily basis, every week, same as me, are all women. Every commissioning editor at every publishing house is a woman. Every agent almost that any of these authors, male or female, that then got them deals in the publishing world is a woman. But almost every commissioning book section editor is a woman. I have been in this profession for a long, long time. I've never had a man sign a check for me.
Really?
So when I see the few vestiges of, when I see the argument revived by blue check marks on Twitter about how, about how I'm from some part of oppressive class and everyone who's a woman is Susan B. Anthony being beaten on the sidewalk, I want to say that's true in a lot of areas of the world and a lot of areas of society, but we can see that it's not true in this book review.
And I'm not a close follower of Twitter, much less the blue check marks on Twitter, but
no, that's well.
But when I do see people critiquing, and it's not that women are writing, it's the or underrepresented, it's the people who have not traditionally been represented, including white women who have been, are being excluded more, which I think is changing. But there are people who have not been represented in these pages, I'm sure, although it's quite a bit more diverse than it might have been back when I was reading it in grad school or whatever.
Yeah, that was one of the questions that I was going to start with. Is your own history with the book review?
I think I started reading it when I was in college. We must have had access to free subscriptions to the New York Times. I didn't grow up with the New York Times. I grew up in the South, and we read the local paper, and that was about it. We had a state paper as well. Say it again?
Not the Post? Not the Washington?
No, and my father occasionally read the Washington Post, but only when it's not something we could have picked up locally. We would have had to either subscribe but we did subscribe to the state paper for South Carolina. And when we were really being fancy, we'd get the the Charlotte Observer from North Carolina, which was the big fancy paper and real national news more than local news, which I grew up with. A weekly that we called, I grew up in Laurinburg, North Carolina, a little tiny town, and the paper was called the Laurinburg Exchange. And we joked that it was the Laurinburg excuse, but it was lovely. It had, all of the stats for little league games and things like that. It was terrific.
I am currently published in such a paper, and they are a gem. I wonder if that paper still exists.
It did at least a couple of years ago. I haven't looked recently.
So, well, I've been reading the book review forever. I very much miss Once Upon a Time, for a long time, for decades. It was extremely common for you to be able to buy the book review, the Sunday book review, separate from the Sunday paper.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. In every bookstore. It was right up there at the registers, or it was at the newsstand. So I didn't have to think about the big wad of the Sunday paper. I could just get the book review. Although we decided ahead of time, right, that we would not talk about the rest of the paper.
Well, especially this week when I have not read anything other than a column or two, like Modern Love, maybe, or something like that. So.
But you've got thousands and thousands of words to read.
Yes, it's all stacked up on the coffee table.
Well, I can give you a quick summary. There are a couple of things that really stuck out to me. Number one is sad. The Gerber baby died.
Oh.
The woman who was the Gerber baby forever and ever and ever. All you mothers out there will know that face in a heartbeat. And that person was alive. She finally died.
Wow.
And also the 911, the emergency operator in Buffalo, who took a phone calls from someone in the supermarket, and the person was desperately saying the address and how many people and whatnot, and the emergency operator started yelling at the person, saying, "Why are you whispering? You don't need to whisper." And the person said, "He's still here and he's still shooting," and the emergency operator hung up on her.
Oh no.
And there was an article saying that person has been fired. She has not been identified, but she has lost her job. And I didn't know that detail.
It's not all that different from the Texas shooting situation.
I think you could make it worse. Is that the one thing that makes these stories worse is that the people were calling for help and not getting it. It'd be one thing if they were incommunicado, but
just stunning.
So you're not missing much for the rest of the paper. But let's just concentrate on the review.
Sounds good.
Now that I've started off with a rabble-rousing note, we can just let that go and talk about the wonderful world of books. What stood out to you?
Well, actually, I was going to ask you if there are books that you have already reviewed in print or have coming out really rapidly, really soon from in here.
That I didn't do. The only one is the Candice Millard book. The history book by Candice Millard. That's the only one. That's not out yet. My review has not run. I don't think there are any others. There are quite a few that I got in the mail, but I don't think there are any others. Like Lena Jinska, I got the Premonitions Bureau. I got those things, but I haven't. No. What about you?
I read Ben Shattuck's book, Six Walks, about following the footsteps of Thoreau, which is just lovely. And I reviewed it on the Seawall, which actually has a male person signing the checks. So, but I love writing for them. And yeah.
I should also mention that my hyperbole got the best of me, as it sometimes does. My editor for the Vineyard Gazette is a man. He writes the checks as well. So, but still, you were very self-indulgent anyway to put up with that. So, did anything? Tell me some of the things that jumped out at you.
Well, I thought the Nijinsky story sounded really great. I was so intrigued. Have you read the book already? Because I haven't. What do you think of the book?
I didn't like it as much as the reviewer did. The reviewer, but then again, how much did the reviewer like the book? The review. Should we go straight to that? The review was mostly summer. I mean, it's a terrific story, but
yeah, I think that may be why I was intrigued by it. Is that it seemed like a book I'd want to read because of the subject, not because it was a great book necessarily.
That happens a lot in this review, more often than I would wish. That's the thing that always drives me away from the Times book review during the times when I say, "Oh, I'm done with this." That's always the reason. that the reviews are just summaries of the books, which,
Yeah.
as I always tell people, I always repeat it over and over again, that book reviewing is a kind of writing on its own. It's not just a book report. But for instance, in the historical fiction section, which is written by Alida Becker,
Yeah.
the one of the only men whose books are reviewed in that section, and by far the most famous writer in the whole section, is Thomas Keneally. And his new book is The Dickens Boy. It gets one paragraph. And
Yeah, I saw that. That was the one I read. It was like, oh, I would like, and then I thought,
but
yeah, well,
in
interestingly, I almost had the opposite response, that I read a couple of reviews, which I'll get to later, but I read a couple of reviews that I thought the review itself made me not want to read a book I thought I might want to. So,
oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
But not necessarily because they were panning it. Maybe just because they were telling you enough about it. So that, oh, really?
Or because they were telling me particular things that I thought, that's not the book for me, or the book for me at this moment, for example.
Okay. So what about the alternative? So some reviews put you off investigating the book further because you learn enough about the book in the course of the review to let you say, this isn't for me. What about the opposite? What about a book review that pans a book? Does that ever turn you off from a book, or is it always the opposite?
Oh, that's a good question. It's so rare to see a pan these days,
Yeah.
that I'm not
The problem on its own.
Oh yeah, though actually there's one here that's not, I wouldn't call a pan, but that the book that I wanted to read most of all, of everything I read in here, the reviewer says something very positive, but also really critiques the book. And that's it's David Van's review of Seven Steeples,
Right.
by Sarah Baumel. Do you know how to pronounce her name? I'm
No.
sure I'm going to mispronounce everybody's names in here. And it's a book about a young couple who live on the coast of Ireland. And he calls it something like The Story of Hermitage or something. And it just sounds so quiet. And he talks about how absolutely stunningly beautifully it's written, but that it's a book without conflict and without drama. And I was like, okay, I totally see why a lot of people would not find that book perfect, but this is a book about summer reading, and I cannot think of anything I want to read more on vacation than quiet, still, peaceful, vacation type travel books. Whether it's a quiet beach or a winter beach, even if I'm reading in the summer, the idea of that.
But you thought,
and I love beautiful language.
You thought the review was fair, even so.
Oh yeah, I mean, I haven't read the book, so but it's one that I had not even heard of, and after I read it, I was like, oh, that's a book for me. But I don't think it's a pan at all.
In the historical fiction section, at one point, who is it? Alida Becker reviews The Prophet's Wife by Emma Hale. Or no, not by Emma Hale. Who wrote? It's Libby Grant. Libby Grant writes a book called The Prophet's Wife about Joseph Smith. They actually put a picture of him on the page, and a review of The Prophet's Wife is one paragraph long, and there is not a single evaluative word anywhere in it. It is simply reworked cover copy. Amazing. I mean, that'd be bad enough, in the Poughkeepsie Herald, but to be in the Sunday New York Times Book Review and it's just someone reworking cover copy for what I can only assume is a healthy paycheck, that was just scandalous.
Although I will say that while I loved having the roundups, the actual reviews were pretty limited, but roundups don't appear in the book review very often. And I think that's a special section edition.
Right, and they do present challenges of their own.
Yes, especially those little short.
Yeah, they're not easy to do, but.
And interestingly, one of the biggest surprises for me, which I would not have even read these reviews had I not been planning to have this discussion with you, but because I figured I should read the thriller section and the true crime section, etc., which I didn't make it all the way through to the end during that, but I did read those. And I thought I'm not someone who tends to like thrillers, and I don't know that I've even read true crime before, but it didn't seem like it was something that I would like. And I was absolutely fascinated by a book in each section. The one in the true crime was about the two doctors. I forgot their names.
Were well done.
Gilmers, two Dr. Gilmers. And the first one apparently had like killed his father by cutting off his fingers with pruning shears or some grotesque thing. And this was, of course, in rural Virginia, fairly near where I live. And the new doctor who took his place was unrelated, but was also named Dr. Gilmer. And all the patients said, "Oh, we loved him." And then finally someone says, he's getting out of jail and he knows what you're doing and he's going to come back to get you. And so the guy was terrified, the new Dr. Gilmer, second Dr. Gilmer. But then he starts investigating the story, and it winds up, or at least by the summary, saying that he realized something was really wrong and that the man was probably mentally ill and needed help. And so there's this great empathy, and rather than being, just for drama or just for thrills, it's got this, maybe that's what true crime is that it has a broader context. But that sounded fascinating.
I had my problems with empathy in this issue. Some might say I have problems with empathy just in general, but
I was going to raise that issue because it's brought up in a lot.
It comes up a lot. I have an example in mind from Christine Kennelly's review of The Mind and the Moon about the science of the brain. There's a paragraph at the end. Fortunately, as the author reports, alternatives to biological psychiatry are being developed all over the world. Carolyn, the woman whose story the author tells, now works with one such program, providing peer support to others. She has learned to listen to her own voices too. We mean the voices in her head.
And that's how this
sat down with her for the first time. She said, "I've told them you're not here to hurt them." And she counsels other people.
That's an intriguing review because it starts with this discussion of the author trying to help readers imagine what it's like to hear voices in your head. And I'd never really thought about it that way, but it felt almost, I mean, I tend to be very moved by the concept of empathy in general. And I've thought recently that talks about empathy are sometimes at odds with talks about speaking for somebody else, or trying to imagine that we could understand the experience of other people, and especially people who've grown up in very different kinds of circumstances, whether it's having a mental illness or being of a different ethnicity or whatever. And often I kind of resist that. I think empathy is still a worthy goal, but in this case, it became, I don't know, it sort of pushed me over to the feeling of it felt off-putting.
I'm all for empathy, but only the 21st century would consider normalizing the idea that you hear articulated voices in your head. That has literally for 7,000 years been an indicator that you have a mental illness that needs to be helped, that needs to be treated. Not that you become accustomed to your voices and tell your interviewer that they're okay with you.
Do you think the reviewer was really saying that? I thought the reviewer was trying to say listening to the people with mental illness, not listening to the voices in her head.
No, that in that quote, she's talking about the voices in her own head. She's told them that the interviewer means them no harm when they shouldn't be there. She shouldn't be having plenary sessions with them. She should be treated until she doesn't hear voices anymore. But
and that's the review that talks about the relatively young girl playing Scrabble with one of the voices in her head. I thought that was just totally intriguing. That sort of non-threatening, even though the person she was playing Scrabble with was telling her how her mother was going to die or something.
Right. Well, right. And I mean, it always amazes me when we have this kind of discussion. You and I usually have it in private over wine, but it always amazes me that we have turned being courteous and being non-judgmental into just accept. If a woman can tell her interviewer, "It's okay, I told the voices in my head that you're no danger to them," then that woman could easily tell the voices in her head, "I've told them you are a danger to them." Why are we accepting this? It's just a part of the narrative, instead of the interviewer immediately saying, instead of good, that's great, how accepting, you really need help and you need to be locked away until you get it. I just
So you've talked sometimes when you get books in the mail that have something written, either a blurb or a printout talking about the book in ways that you find kind of appalling, and often say, well, I'll let the book actually speak.
Right.
Is it possible that this is just the reviewer?
This is one of the ones where I haven't. Well, he's quoting there, so it can't be only the reviewer. That quote appears in the book, but I haven't read this one. It's one of the ones I can't believe I didn't do that stat. I feel undressed without it. But when it comes to, to empathizing, to imagining someone else's circumstance, that brings me right to another quote that jumped out at me, if you don't mind.
Oh, please. I have one too.
The review of Peter Baker's book, Planes, by Lala Khadivi. There's a paragraph at the end. You always go to the end. At the end is always when the writer's going to put the cards on the table. The writer of the review says, the debate continues over whether imagining the other, writing outside one's identity with respect and empathy, actually works in fiction. No idea there was such a debate. And when the reviewer says the debate continues, the reviewer clearly means the debate shouldn't continue. But she goes on, we live in a moment of great reckoning. Amira, the main character in the book, is an interesting contribution to the conversation. The specificity of her Esquilino neighborhood, her nervous lunches with an old flame, her satisfaction in practicing Islam had me turning the book over to look at the author's name and wonder, how does this Baker know what it is to be Amira? Unbelievable, just unbelievable.
I should have caught that was going to be one that you brought up.
Well, tell me how that isn't bigotry. The reviewer is explicitly admitting that she's looking at the author to tell whether or not, by looking at him, he has any ability to write what he's talking about. How is that? Well, people didn't tune in, just have me rant. Wouldn't such an admission give you pause?
Well, interestingly, I was thinking about one of the nonfiction books that relies on that idea of empathy, and I have read the book as well. And it's the I forgot what it's called. It's Teresa Brown's book on breast cancer. The nurse.
Right.
What is that called?
I'm not going to find
Healing.
it. Zoom,
Healing, right?
We're running out of time. Yes, that's right.
Oh gosh, yeah. So it's reviewed relatively critically by a woman who read books that I've also read, but the book is about a nurse who experiences. She's an oncology nurse who works in hospice sometimes, and she experiences a diagnosis of very low level breast cancer, and she's just furious and angry, partly because she feels so unable to control her experiences. And what she says is, I never empathized with my patients when they were feeling furious and angry until I got sick myself. And therefore I quit medicine. I quit working as a nurse. And it was like, okay, so how? That's not empathy if you don't think about the patients in front of you. And so I disliked the book, and I realized that it was perhaps not fair, but it just hinged on that argument that she grew because of her illness, which is a great argument, but to admit that she was not sympathetic to their anger, and her rage comes across as petty rather than as deep rage. So I don't know. That empathy question is quite different, I guess, but it still has that, you have to experience it to know it. And I don't think that's accurate.
And on the subject of you have to experience it to know it, I want to do one more gripe of my own before we wrap up, before we run out of time. It's from a review by David Vann of the Seven Steeples review. At one point in that review at the end, he writes, the author's description of landscapes are lovelier than I can express. You'll simply have to read them yourself. And I read that on the subway and groaned out loud. A book reviewer literally saying, you just got to read it, which is the ultimate white flag, is the ultimate sign of defeat, of surrender.
for a book reviewer, is to reach some point in your review where you say, I can't, you're just gonna have to read it first.
Run
Man,
out of words here. Sorry.
I know, it's just
Reach my
mad.
page limit.
Makes me, when I see stuff like that, or some of the hot button stuff that I've mentioned before, in connection with the book review, before we run out of time, I gotta ask, we'll do this again? Maybe we'll do this again. I already know what people are gonna say.
I'd love to do it again.
They're going to say they want more of you and less of me. They have a channel to hear me ranting. And that'll definitely happen.
Well, I even have a question about this book's review, which I'm going to hold for next time. So,
well, I'm wondering, just in general, this is a question I could ask anytime we do this, is what does this make you think about your own review? Just in general, or even in specific. I mean, do you go through this and see things and think, oh, I must remember not to do that. This is what it looks like. So when I do that, this is how bad it looks.
well, I was going to say that one of the questions, I think if I knew that you were going to go through my review like this, I would not want to write reviews publicly. But the question
Oh,
that I
these
said I
people
wanted,
are big. They're adults. They can handle it.
the question that I wanted to hold was actually kind of related to this, that there was a review in here that I found fascinating, that I thought gave me an example of something I did want to be able to do in writing. And I wanted to ask you about why, and I'm not sure we have enough
We do.
time.
We have a little time.
Okay.
We can finish it up.
It's the discussion about what's her name? I wrote it down. She's talking about stage and screen. So she's a theater critic, Helen Shaw, and she writes with such energy and voice. And you've talked about how reviewers often write without voice, or don't, especially new reviewers like me, etc. And she just sparkles on the page. Is that more common in theater reviewers, or?
It is.
Interesting.
Yeah. It largely because editors tend to think that's what a theater review is. It should be common everywhere. But how many times have you had an editor, or I've had an editor, where you're writing a book review, you get to that point, paragraph 7, where you want to just add a little flair, where you want to let the reader know you're actually in the room. How many times have I had an editor say, that's, I don't think I kind of like to take that out. I mean, what point does it serve?
Huh.
I
don't think I've ever put any flair in. So I'm still working on getting a voice. So.
I always want to, I never do, but I always want to say, well, the reason why that's in there is because the readers will appreciate it. So maybe you should get your buttery fingers out of the whole equation. It doesn't involve you. If you just leave it alone, the readers will appreciate it. But I don't ever say that. No, really cautionary tales. I mean, obviously, if you read a paragraph that's supposed to be a review of a book that doesn't evaluate it in any way, that's going to be a little reminder never to do that, right? That you don't want to do that.
Right. Although in these roundups, again, to a degree, it's about putting things in discussion with each other and not necessarily pure evaluation. So I'm not sure I was as hard on it within the little short roundup sections where we're talking about a lot of different books.
No, I'm merciless on that.
Might be interested in this one.
If you want what happens in the book, you can go to Amazon or Goodreads and get that. That doesn't belong in the New York Times book review, not all by itself. Right. I don't care if you're rounding up 10.
Gotcha.
I've done that. Yep. I've done 10 book roundups, and you still have to evaluate every book. Otherwise, what are you doing there? You know, the reader can find that stuff elsewhere.
Yeah, you persuaded me.
Were there any buys from this book review? Any things that actually tipped the scale into the basket?
Not so far.
There weren't any.
There's one that I'm pretty sure I will check out of the library, which is the novel The Foundling by Anne Leary, which I'm not sure it's going to be a book I love as fiction, but by talking about the intersections of feminism, early feminism, and eugenics in state institutions, it's just so right up my historical interest alley. Yes. I have a feeling I'll have to read that one.
I hadn't thought of that, but you couldn't leave that alone. But then again, what if it's leadenly done?
Well, that's why I think I'll check it out at the library.
Yeah.
And if it were nonfiction, I'm sure I would buy it. Yeah.
So
Um,
you might be up for going through the book review next week,
I would love to.
provided
That would be great.
there aren't hosannas of hatred. It doesn't really matter. It's just we're two dedicated lifelong readers who also are book reviewers. We thought it might be interesting to go through the foremost book review in the country. I got off a little ranting.
Yeah, and maybe we can meet for a few minutes beforehand, and you can do your ranting, and then we can do the recording.
Although there are those who say that my store of ranting is endless.
Yes, and everybody's here for Frida and for your rants. So
baby's dead tired of rants. We went on a walk just a little bit ago, and it's still wiped her out because it's a little warm outside. But there were no buys for me either. I don't know. I never know really how positive that is. We both get books in the mail, so a lot. I'm not 100% sure. When I look through this thing, some of the reviews in here might have tipped me over if I didn't already have the book. So I'm not sure that I'm estimating that correctly. And some of them are relatively free of actual evaluation. Lady Antonia Fraser's book is in here. It gets one word. There's one word of evaluation. All the rest of it is plot summary.
Yeah.
Same thing with the Candice Millard. It gets barely anything in the way of how is it as a book. But I'm all for doing this again.
that'll be great.
I will go and get the next one. Will be more manageable length.
That'll be
Boy,
great
though.
too.
50 reviews. What a thing. What an amazing thing. Quibbles here and there. What an amazing thing.
Yeah.
Go and get that.
And there are a lot of really interesting reviews, but